passed around a few documents. One is a timeline that will be relevant to this conversation. The other is a selection of documents that you'll find in the Sargent Shriver Case Study Seminar number 4 Dropbox folder, which I think most of you should have access to. If you don't, come and see me afterwards. There are some extraordinary documents here. There are a few that we've included just in text form here for the purposes of our discussion today. The top document actually is a handwritten note that Sargent Shriver wrote to President Kennedy in the early part of 1961 about a matter that we'll discuss here. The issue with that letter, as some of the other documents, I think, is just to illustrate a particular manner and style of communication, which struck me as I was reading over many of the documents, and I think there are some lessons we can draw from that as well. And if anybody needs...
What, are you struck by the informality of that?
Yes, I was also, well, I'm struck by a couple things. We'll get to it when we get to it. Is that all right? Because I think there's both the informality, but there's also a way of very clearly stating what it is that you need and want, and also establishing, in this case, sort of a fall on the sword move that does two things.
Do you think he was serious about that?
No, I don't. But I'll be curious to get your take on that too. So exactly the point I was going to make. So anyway, today's session is session 4 in our series of conversations that examine in great detail the establishment of the Peace Corps as part of the Shriver program. This program, this session is called Institutionalizing the Peace Corps, Convincing Congress and the White House. So as we ended last week's session, we did so with Sargent Shriver's report to the President recommending a structure for the Peace Corps to refresh the memories of those who were with us and to get everybody else up to speed. There are a lot of component parts of this, but for the purpose of this conversation, one of the key elements and a critical element for this conversation today is that he insisted on autonomy and that the Peace Corps be freed from not only the bureaucratic constraints of government, but perhaps even more importantly, freed from the competing agendas of U.S. foreign policies, so that Peace Corps volunteers would be free to work in a people-to-people environment with the utmost focus on transforming the way in which we relate to others in the world and not be seen merely as a tool of U.S. foreign policy. Are there any questions on the basis of last week's session before we jump into today? Okay. Yeah.
No.
Oh, all right. So, all right, without further ado, what we're going to do today is we're going to pick up in March of 1961, just after Sargent Shriver has submitted the report to the President. We are going to stop at key decision points and junctures in this chronology and actually talk about what you would do in these circumstances as it relates to authorization for this program and design for it within the executive branch, and as well as the authorization on Capitol Hill, should we have time to get through all of those materials today. So, Bill, let me start with you if you don't mind. March 1st, 1961, President Kennedy, just within a week or so of getting the order from, or getting the report from Sargent Shriver, signs an executive order establishing the Peace Corps, also delivers a special message to Congress, and essentially endorsing the design that we've talked about, right?
Right.
And so as far as we understand it, everything is great. Shriver's cooking with gas, the President's on board, and now he's got to go start building this program. Is that a fair characterization? At that very
fair
moment?
So far.
Okay.
Right.
So what did he ask you to do?
Well, you have to go back a little bit, because in February, I was essentially working 2 tracks. Vision is always important, you know, overall policy is always important, but nuts and bolts are also extraordinarily important. And you got to keep both in mind. I began working on the executive order immediately at the same time that we were transforming the towering task with the aid of the experts that Shriver brought in into what became the report to the president. An executive order is not something that progresses through the United States government overnight. There's a process. And the process was particularly complicated in this case by two factors. First of all, you know, I was on detail to this task force. I had no status whatsoever. I was still actually technically a State Department employee, and I was therefore still technically subject to the review of the General Counsel of the State Department, who goes by the quaint old title of legal advisor. And so the first step when I had a draft of an executive order was to push it through the legal advisor's office. And once we had agreed upon that, all executive orders go through what is now called the Office of Management and Budget, was then called the Bureau of the Budget. And there was a particular legendary person in that bureau, Fred Levy, who had worked on every executive order since George Washington. And so the draft that emerged from my work with the legal advisor then was subject of negotiation with Levy. And that was very interesting because he cut it down to the essentials that now appear. And then this next step was in the White House itself, dealing with Ted Sorensen as the president's counsel, and then with a wonderful man who was then the chief White House clerk, who had also been there since George Washington, and who actually made sure that executive orders were in proper form and presented to the president in the proper way. So all of this was going on while all the programmatic work was going on, and it's important for all of you to keep in mind the importance of the nuts and bolts at the same time.
Right. The executive order itself, which is included in the folder of documents that we've provided to you, is very short. March 2nd, 1961, contains 4 key points. I'm sorry, it's provided in your online packet, but not in front of you. I'll just summarize it. Section 1, establishment of the Peace Corps, basically says the Secretary of State shall create this thing in the Department of State, known as the Peace Corps, and it shall have a director. Number 2, the purpose of it, functions of the Peace Corps. It shall be responsible for training, for the training and service abroad of men and women to the United States in new programs of assistance to nations and areas of the world, and it can be done so in support of existing economic assistance programs of the U.S. or the United Nations or other international organizations. Basically, essentially saying, all right, this is what it's going to do, and we understand that it will have the ability to collaborate with other entities in the pursuance of its overall goal. Financing of the Peace Corps. The Secretary of State shall provide for the financing of the Peace Corps with funds available to the Secretary for the performance of the functions under particular statute. And this order shall not be deemed to supersede or derogate from any provision of other executive orders previously. And that's really about it, right?
That was about it.
Okay. So.
And we had identified the source of funds.
Got it.
Which was very important. There was a contingency fund in the Mutual Security Appropriation Act, and we got approval to tap that to the tune of $30 million.
Okay. Then you're involved in one of the other early questions, which is the appointment of Sergeant Shriver as Director of the Peace Corps. So 2 days later, JFK, to no one's surprise, appoints Sergeant Shriver. We saw last week that he had already called him up and said, I want you to lead this new thing called the Peace Corps. And right off the bat, there was a question over how that appointment should actually move forward and whether the Senate should be involved in confirming it. What was going on there?
The question was a question of status. Status, unfortunately, in a bureaucracy turns out to be almost more important than anything else. And so, you know, the Secretary of State, the Deputy Secretary, the Undersecretaries, all of the Assistant Secretaries, they were all presidential appointees confirmed by the Senate. So was the head of the foreign aid program. And Sarge and I felt strongly that he should have the same status, and also that the Senate should be early on involved in his appointment, because congressional support, congressional endorsement of this program, which was quite controversial in certain circles, would be an extremely important element of cachet. You may not think cachet is very important, but in fact, in a bureaucracy in Washington, cachet is extremely important. People fight over the size of their rooms, the number of flags they have.
Yeah. Well, Jamie, so what we have here with, so he didn't need necessarily confirmation from the Senate, right? He could have just been appointed director.
Right.
So what's Sarge's strategy here? Why is it important for him, above and beyond the practical considerations that Bill Josephson just laid out, why is it important for him to go through what could be a more cumbersome step in this?
Well, I think just to build on what Bill has been saying, you have the way the Peace Corps program was presented. The director would have roughly the same status as a Undersecretary of State. Would that be right, Bill?
Close to that.
Close to that. And people at that level had been appointed by would have been appointed by the Senate. And so to be negotiating with and dealing with people at your level without having the same status would be a problem. I'm not exactly sure, Bill probably can tell us, why there was any resistance in the White House to do a Senate confirmation for this, but I think there must have been some threat generated, or maybe they didn't think about it at all.
Well, I don't know whether the documents are in the package, but there is a document in the syllabus from me to Richard Goodwin, which, makes these points, expresses at a staff level to the deputy counsel in the White House why I think it's important. And I no longer remember, Steve, you've got the documents in front of me. The Shriver's letter is undated.
Yes.
My memo to Dick, I think, is the 2nd of March.
It's March 3rd, 1961,
March 3rd.
To Richard Goodwin from William Josephson.
Yes.
Subject, why the director of the Peace Corps, in addition to being appointed by the President, should be confirmed by the Senate.
Right.
And you actually begin with a constitutional argument.
Correct.
About powers of the various branches. You also then go on to compatible rank. You talk about the opportune time. And then on the document that I have here, it's in the digital file that I referenced earlier, there's just a note that says, JFK, I agree with this memorandum and submit it for your serious consideration, RSS. So that's Shriver to the President. And then we presume, we don't have a date on this, but we presume this letter follows sometime thereafter. And this is the top of your document.
Or maybe the letter is on top of my document.
It could be yes, the letter
I don't really know.
Could go with it. So, anybody care to read this letter by chance?
You mean out loud to us?
Yeah. I think, or we can go over the salient points. I'm happy to read it as well. I hope you realize by now that I do anything within reason to help your administration to the best of my ability. But the question of my proposed appointment and its confirmation by the Senate is causing me and the people working for me deep concern. I know that Kenny and Ted S., and perhaps others, disagree with my position. These are advisors to
Well, we
Kenny
need to identify them. They're very
please,
important. So, there was a group in the White House that had been with Kennedy for forever, who were known as the Irish Mafia. And Kenny O'Donnell was clearly the leader of the Irish Mafia, and in many ways the person who was temperamentally closest to JFK.
And Ted S. is Ted Sorensen?
Is Ted Sorensen. Ted is actually a Jewish fellow from Lincoln, Nebraska, of all things. But he had been Kennedy's counsel in the Senate and his chief speechwriter for forever. So here are two of the most important Kennedy advisors who have always, as I've described in prior sessions, been anxious about JFK's relationship with Sarge. And I think this anxiety now expresses itself in their desire to constrain his status.
And he says, they disagree with my position, but despite them, I don't want to embark on a difficult mission with one arm tied behind my back. It would be a serious mistake in my judgment to appoint me as director of the Peace Corps, which is now a full-fledged agency, and then make me the only agency head in the government not approved by the Senate. So he doesn't want to be singled out in this way. This is not good for the agency, the people in it, or for me. When I do have to face Congress in May, June, or July, they'll be tougher then, and they will have no responsibility for having okayed me now. So
That's a crucial point.
He's thinking ahead. How does he convince Congress to go on along with this plan? He may need Congress. So he's playing the long game here. He's thinking about, how am I building a coalition for this enterprise, essentially, and doing an expedient thing, which in other cases would be just a fine short-term solution, an easy pathway, actually would create long-term harm. So he's being strategic in this. Consequently, I respectfully suggest that you select another person to head the Peace Corps, which is now well-organized, well-manned, and aimed in the right direction. There are plenty of qualified people, Rostow of Yale, White of Chicago, Clark Kerr of California, etc. They, others like them, would be glad to serve you, and they would relieve you of this difficult burden. You have enough problems. Let's eliminate this one. Best, Sarge. So there's a lot going on in that letter. Bill, what's Sarge really trying to do in your
Well,
opinion?
I think that what Sarge is trying to do is acknowledge, first of all, that the opposition of Kenny O'Donnell and Ted Sorensen is very powerful opposition. I think he's also trying to make it clear to the president that the president has options, but that one of the options is not that he would serve without Senate confirmation. And I think the importance to Sarge of Senate confirmation is twofold. Not only is it an early endorsement of the program and of himself as fit to head the program, but we knew, and this will become apparent as we get into some of the congressional documents, which we may not have time for today, but we certainly will have time for tomorrow, next Friday rather. We knew that Fulbright was not happy with the notion of the Peace Corps.
Senator Fulbright.
Senator Fulbright, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a Fulbright, a Rhodes Scholar from Arkansas.
What strikes you about this letter, those of you here? Why is he offer his, I mean, he's essentially offering his resignation right now. Why? It's just, I mean, it seems to be, this is me editorializing here, it seems to be a fairly minor procedural point in the grand scheme of things, given all that we've learned thus far, on which to offer your resignation, which is essentially what he's doing. Yeah,
Well, I feel like by offering specific other people, it's almost like he's saying, don't actually consider these people, you really want me to do the job. So I feel like in that sense it's kind of, he didn't really mean that.
yeah.
You think it's being disingenuous?
Not, I mean, in the sense that I think he wants the job, but he has to have, you know, a backup plan in case it doesn't go as planned. And he wants a job to get it in a legit way.
Yeah.
And it's also just like an early proxy of the amount of support that he truly has from Kennedy, and just to know early on, because you said that he wanted autonomy for the program, and so this is just like the first chance that he gets to really test that level of autonomy.
Yeah.
Also, it's, as you already said, like a small power struggle with O'Donnell and Sorensen, because he basically says it's them or me. Who do you trust more? Because they say this shouldn't go forward, I say it should. Now it's your decision.
So you see it as a power play?
A bit, yeah.
Any other thoughts on that? Yeah. Jamie?
My one thought is, I mean, it may be that Sarge is still thinking, you know, going back to Chicago is not the worst thing in the world. I've been working hard for a month, and I could still maybe go back and work at the Mart and become governor or senator, and that's okay with me. I think he's free in this decision. I don't think he's constrained. I don't think he's. I think he means it. I don't think he thinks his brother-in-law will accept it, but but who knows?
Yeah.
I have a question. I'm just curious, surrounding the conversation, was there any talk about how many relatives JFK could appoint before it was too many relatives?
Well, what relatives are you thinking?
His brother comes to mind. We have his brother-in-law up for consideration.
Right.
I just compare that, I think, to the political climate today, where it's hard to get someone like Susan Rice through a nomination process, right? I can't even imagine what it would be like if Barack Obama tried to nominate a sibling or his wife's brother, as talented actually as his wife's brother is, to a post in the government, especially such a high post.
Well, I think you're right. I think that certainly, you know, the story about how he announced Robert Kennedy as Attorney General is kind of hilarious. He told the story that he was going to announce him by opening the door of his Georgetown home at 2 in the morning and simply whispering, "It's Bobby." So, yes, you're right. This was an important factor. But remember, the Peace Corps was hardly regarded as a plum job. In fact, Sarge famously used the notion that it was a lemon. And someone commented, yes, it may have been a lemon, but you squeezed it and it made lemonade. There's another famous quote from Sarge, that I think at the first Meet the Press conference, where one of the reporters says to him, well, you're way out on a limb, aren't you, Sarge? And Sarge says, out on a limb? I'm walking on the leaves.
This same week, we're going to get into the meat of this just a second. I'm sorry to be spending all this time on a couple of days. But there are the next two documents in your packet are actual, should be if we have this right. Actually, go ahead, one more document too. There are two one's a letter to the editor, and the other is the editorial from the Wall Street Journal. It's titled, "It's a Puzzlement." So this is March 6th. And one final point on this letter to the president that we just were talking about. I do think I think it's interesting, all the different interpretations around the table. I think any one of them or multiple interpretations could be quite valid. I was struck by also the way in which he clearly underscores how important this is to him in two ways. One, stating that it's causing him and his staff deep concern. And second, that this gesture of resignation, whether real or feigned, underscores how important this is. So in the span of a very short few lines, he has communicated that this is not just a frivolous request. This is actually essential, in his view, in ensuring the successful launch of the Peace Corps. And those two things together, I think, are quite extraordinary. I also think he knows that the chances that his brother-in-law will take him up on the offer are somewhat slim, so we can say that. But I think it's a very strong
he's not,
rhetorical device.
Shouldn't underestimate, as we shall see very quickly, the degree to which the Irish Mafia was really opposed to the whole idea.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and I think along that line, I think he's recognizing there that by insisting on this, he has put the president in a bind. That the president is being forced to choose between two groups, Sarge and the Irish Mafia, whom he'd like to please, and who he wants on his side, and who he wants to be working for him and not be resentful. And so his offer to say, if this is going to be too much stress for what you need moving forward politically, I will bow out, is also not just a power play. I mean, I think it's also gracious.
Yeah, yeah. Both of those things I think are important to keep in mind. All right, so it's a puzzlement, Wall Street Journal editorial dated March 6, 1961. So while we're in the weeds on what's going on behind the scenes, I think it's important to take a step back and remember, really there are a couple things going on. As we recall, and as we saw in our previous seminars, there were any number of students around the country expressing deep enthusiasm for this idea. The president has included this in his State of the Union address. We've received numerous instances of the president and others sort of making reference to this in previous campaign speeches and the like. And we get, on the other side, skepticism. So from the Journal, if you go down to the third paragraph here, what is bewildering is the wild and fanciful notions that get wrapped around these ideas. The catchphrase Peace Corps becomes one of the biggest slogans of the campaign. It's the subject of a special message from the president. He goes to Congress to say, I've authorized this. It is and before you know it, the trumpets are sounding and the whole thing takes on the ardor of a revival meeting. An army of young people fresh out of college is going to go swarming all over the world, spreading the gospel of America and saving the free world from the barbarians. The only sentence missing there is get real. So that's this editorial.
And remember also Eisenhower's Kitty Corps quote.
Tell us about it. Yeah.
Well, that's it. Ike was asked what he thought about the Peace Corps, and he said, I think it should be called the Kitty Corps.
So this is the sort of rhetorical environment in which these plans are playing out. The next one should be an editorial, or a letter to the editor from Henry Lee from Wilmette, March 2nd, Chicago Daily Tribune, a short little piece, second paragraph. He says, we agree that the ideas behind the Peace Corps are good, but what disturbs us is whether these ideas would work in view of the apparent failure of our numerous post-war programs in different countries. And here's the great line. Will we again send thousands of arrogant, poorly trained, party and cocktail-loving Americans on a holiday spree all over the world as we did after World War II? So deep skepticism in terms of the realities of this program. So the Journal's saying, you know, okay, fine if you want to do this, but really, is this going to have a profound effect? All the way down to the Kitty Corps comments and whether these are just a bunch of excited post-grads who are looking for an excuse to travel abroad somewhat debaucherously. So that's what's going on. So jump ahead now to the pivot point. End of the month, JFK goes to Congress, delivers a special message about foreign aid. And Jamie, just by way of background, we have the Peace Corps as one thread to Kennedy's foreign policy views and hopes for the world. A reorganization of foreign aid is a separate thread, right? What's happening there?
Yeah, and I don't know that it's so much a separate thread. I mean, if you remember the Cow Palace address, he talks about the problem with our foreign aid and the importance of revising that for our security, particularly in the Cold War. Talks about the Peace Corps in that context. So he's got two task forces going on. One is the task force we've been studying, led by Sarge, staffed by Bill. But another parallel one is, what are we going to do about foreign aid to make it real, to make it work, to make it not just this hodgepodge of programs? And I don't know that, I mean, that the president had really differentiated the two the way we are and the way Sarge clearly did.
Beginning of the month, executive order endorses the idea that the Peace Corps is autonomous and independent within the State Department. By the end of the month, JFK goes back up to Congress, delivers a special message on foreign aid, and what happens? What's the design
Can we
of that?
back up a little bit again?
Of course, of
All
course.
Right. So, as we will learn in the last session, the irony here is that Warren and I got into the whole Peace Corps issue because we were proposing serious changes in the foreign aid program, and that paper is part of the documents in the last session. And throughout this time, I'm still technically a State Department employee. And in fact, the State Department was extremely unwilling to release me to the task force. They actually sent another foreign aid lawyer over there instead of me, and offered me what was the plum job, ironically, in this context. That is to say, in charge of the State Department's legislative program. In other words, I would have been sitting on top of the whole proposal to reorganize the foreign aid program. And I turned it down. Why did I turn it down? I turned it down because, you know, it seemed to me that the future lay with this great man. My future also lay with this great man, and not with a career in the State Department bureaucracy, however wonderful and that satisfying that might have been. Nevertheless, I was a member of what was called the Legislative Program Group, and simultaneously with working on the President's report, with working on the executive order, I was also the Peace Corps' representative to the Legislative Program Group that was working on the foreign aid legislation. So here am I in the middle of all of this.
So then take us to what Kennedy does with foreign aid as it relates to the Peace Corps.
We received a draft of the special message on a Thursday or Friday, and it very firmly stated that the Peace Corps would be part of the foreign aid program. Now, this was a message that comes from Ted Sorensen and Richard Goodwin, from the two White House counsel. This was very distressing to Warren and me. Sarge was in Boston. We flew to Boston.
That's how distressing it was.
That's how distressing it was. We flew to
Because
Boston.
being part of foreign aid is mean
Death.
you're no longer in
It's
it's
death.
Why is it death?
It's death because, in part because of that wonderful letter from the Tribune. Being part of foreign aid means you're living in an enclave. It means you're high on the hog. It means you're identified not only with the striped pants boys, as Harry Truman used to describe them, but you're identified with military assistance. You're identified with the military assistance related aspects of economic assistance. You even are part of the country team, so to speak, and therefore you would sit with the ambassador and the head of the CIA station. All of that was anathema to us, completely anathema, totally inconsistent with Sarge's and Warren's and my notion about what Peace Corps volunteer service should be. Simple, on the ground, working with your counterparts, no special privileges, no money, no tanks, no perks of any kind. Now,
I have a question here. Yeah.
I just want to clarify. When the Peace Corps started and it was quote unquote autonomous, they did not receive any money?
you mean the volunteers?
Yeah, or not necessarily the volunteers.
They got a living allowance which was determined on a country-by-country basis at a very marginal level.
Okay.
They received no salary. The legislation provided what we called a readjustment allowance that they would receive at the end of their Peace Corps service to help them transition back into non-Peace Corps life.
But it was funded by the U.S. government.
All of this was U.S. government funds.
So like the question I have is like, how do you not want to associate, like, you don't want to associate with the military aspect, the CIA aspect,
And they were explicitly told not to.
but you want to accept the money and like that like.
Well,
that-
but it's not
How
allowed.
independent are you?
Yeah.
The money does not really, is at such a low level that it really doesn't distinguish yourself
Okay.
from the people you're working with.
Okay.
We have a slide up here that shows, in more specific terms, graphically, the difference in the organizational structure here. This is what Shriver and the rest of the Peace Corps proponents on the task force were proposing. So an independent agency under the State Department, but not beholden to another unit, and on equal footing with, USAID director. The foreign aid proposal that Bill is referencing has an organizational structure that looks more like this. So just one program among many, part of a much bigger bureaucracy, part of a much bigger set of decisions, et cetera. So those are the two things in play. So you go to Boston to discuss the real concern here. And JFK essentially goes back on his agreement, right?
Well, I wouldn't say that, no. Sarge was staying at the Ritz-Carlton. We brief him. He agrees. Back in those days, there were things called public stenographers. And we got a public stenographer. And the three of us in the basement of the Ritz-Carlton sat and drafted a memorandum from, I think from me, although I don't really remember anymore. The memorandum can no longer be found. But from me to Richard Goodwin, who was the drafter of the foreign aid message and who had sent it over to us, stating yet again the case for Peace Corps independence. And we flew back to Shriver State in Boston. We flew back to Washington. I walked over to the White House and I delivered the memorandum to Dick. What emerged is incredibly typical when there is a bureaucratic controversy like this. The foreign aid message speaks from both sides of its mouth. It says the Peace Corps will have a relationship to the State Department and foreign aid program, but its special identity and program will be preserved. So this was a, better to fight and run away and fight again another day compromise on both sides.
So I want to know your reaction when this happens, but let me start here. So, but essentially, there's now confusion where there was clarity.
Right.
Best case scenario. There is also the real possibility that you would not operate autonomously when that was an absolutely critical piece of the model that Shriver and the rest of the task force believed to.
And there was a real possibility that the Peace Corps would simply be part of the foreign aid legislation.
Okay, so Kennedy delivers this message to Congress. What would you do if you were Sarge in response? He's just if not gone back on his word, the president, he's certainly reopened a can of worms that everybody thought had been closed and decided.
You all look so perplexed.
Where do you go next? What do you do?
Well, I would say like the easy decision in this case would just like again as
He's done this to Congress too, by the way. This isn't just like behind closed doors. Like
yeah, and
this
like,
is public.
It's a tough decision. I mean, the easy way is he can go back to Chicago and he can easily get another job. But like, I mean, I read the rest of this and clearly like I think his belief in like what in the cause that he was supporting, like propelled him to like reach out to other people, and like maybe distinguish the Peace Corps away from like just the foreign aid proposal. But personally, I don't know. Like that's a really tough decision to make.
I mean, if I was Sarge, I would basically write another letter. I mean, he had the advantage of opening his letters with Dear Jack and not Dear Mr. President, and basically saying, look, you wanted me to establish this program precisely because right now in foreign aid there is nothing like this program. And now you really want us to be working under the foreign aid program, which you yourself deem not enough. Like, of course, I would formulate it maybe.
Make the case back to the president directly.
Right.
And say, what's up? Okay, what else? Yeah.
It would be important to like appeal to the fact that like foreign aid is going through a lot of like changes and reorganization, and saying that you don't want like Peace Corps to like be tangled up in those. And that's why you think like I think that like making an appeal to that like just like obviously like they were happy with the way foreign aid was being handled, and so saying that like putting a Peace Corps under that when like it's going through all this reorganization just kind of like tangle things up even more.
Yeah.
Who would you appeal to?
President Kennedy.
President Kennedy.
So you can see from the timeline, you, Bill, according to the timeline, on April 6th, you write a response. to the President's special message on foreign aid. I assume that's the one that you were referring to Dick Goodwin a second ago that you delivered. It could be a second one.
I think
arguing.
that document looks to me as if it was cribbed from the Ritz-Carlton basement document.
All right, all right. So we've got two appeals. One preemptively, one as a response. You know, I can't believe you did this. It should be independent. And then we have a guy by the name of Henry Labouisse. Who is he?
Henry Labouisse was a very distinguished international civil servant. He was Kennedy's choice to head the foreign aid program. He was the head of the foreign aid program task force. He was a very decent, lovely guy. So decent and so lovely that in the rough and tumble Kennedy administration, he didn't last very long. But at that point, he was certainly somebody one had to reckon with.
Yeah. Yeah. So we see from the timeline, on the 7th, he writes Labouisse, making the case. On the 9th, he meets with Labouisse and George Gantt to further the case. So he actually doesn't go immediately, at least by this timeline, and certainly not exclusively back to the President. He goes to the head of the Foreign Aid Office, Labouisse, and does so in person and through a letter. That letter is included in your packet here. I think it's the second document in, if I'm not mistaken, the top of that letter. I want to draw your attention to the first paragraph and to the last two paragraphs. First paragraph, Dear Mr. Labouisse, you're so busy at the office, and so am I, that I thought I'd take this means of sending you informally 2 documents which I'd like to discuss with you. These documents are, quote, are not, quote, official papers. They have not been staffed out. They're not for circulation among the high mugwumps of officialdom. In fact, about all they represent is an effort on our part to indicate to you personally what our general line of thinking is at the Peace Corps headquarters. He goes on to describe the salient points, why it's important for independence. He's about ready to embark on a trip abroad to get more commitments from countries to accept Peace Corps volunteers. And he says, if you skip down to the bottom of that first page, if I'm going to be able to visit these countries and finalize agreement with them, I've got to get on the road within the next 10 days. Therefore, I'd like to get your agreement on our position before I go. So I want to get clarity here. So all the way at the bottom, he says, those are my reasons for bringing these documents to your attention at your home. I hope that you and I can settle this thing between us without engaging all the troops in a Cecil B. DeMille encounter of lawyers, economists, and other experts. Perhaps this is a wrong way to conduct governmental operations, but I certainly hope that it will be successful in ridding you of a minor headache and relieving me of a major one. Kindest regards. What strikes you about the letter, the approach, those 3 paragraphs? Not the substance of it.
Extremely casual in the sense that like he's like talking to a friend, and I think like that's like even in the previous letter he gave, like he mentions like how like, oh, it's a headache, it's like a big deal to you, it's not a big deal to me. And he just starts off with very casual remarks. And I think that's like it, in a sense, like a way to convince someone is to make it seem like a friendly conversation.
Okay. What else? What strikes you about the passage?
I think it's very positive. It assumes agreement on the part of Mr. Labouisse, which is an interesting strategy because it can offend someone who doesn't agree with you. But if you think they haven't made up their mind and you're saying, well, you're right, I know you agree, let's just deal with this, it can be very persuasive, which I thought was charming.
Yeah, there's some charm to it, actually. You don't see letters written like this these days.
And giving him the short timeline of, I've got to get going within 10 days, so that's why I'm going straight to you rather than working through the official channels, kind of like giving another reason for the casual tone of it, is let's just work this out between us rather than involving all these other people.
Yeah.
So he was trying to obviate a confrontation.
Yeah.
Which is an important strategy, right?
Yeah.
If you can pull that off, if Labouisse can be converted into an ally, that settles the issue, right?
And Jamie, you're our resident expert in conflict resolution and methodology here. So what lens do you bring to this? What do you think's going on here that's particularly relevant to your
I guess I
station
noticed two things. First is that his approach to La Boise is very consistent with what he will want Peace Corps volunteers to do with host country nationals. You know, there may be difference, there may be projections, there may be expectations, and you want to present yourself in a way that meets their needs, that takes them into account, that those kinds of projections can drop. And so here his again, I mean, it's open and it's bold and it's kind of, you know, saying, I know you're busy, you've got a lot going on. This is a minor piece for you. But without, he's not trying to sugarcoat it. This is a major headache for me.
But it's a friendly letter.
It's a very friendly letter.
It's
That's
a
what
friendly
I mean.
letter.
Friendly letter. Yeah.
That's an important aspect of it. Sarge, you know, didn't really make enemies.
Yeah, you can see, one of the reasons why I like this letter is for everything you guys have said, you can really see his mind at work, his heart at work, and his sense of building relationships. I mean, even phrases like, you know, they're not for circulation among the high mugwumps of officialdom. He's saying, he's actually saying, you and I, we're not that, and we know how annoying that is. That we're on, let's just talk mano a mano, two people who just want to get good stuff done. The Cecil B. DeMille encounter of lawyers, economists, and other experts, you know we both don't. He's creating an opportunity for shared identity. We're both busy. I want to come to you directly. We understand how this works. I've got needs, you've got needs. I know you've got a headache. I've got a headache about this. You know, he sent it to his home.
Right.
Sent it to his home. This is not. This is a personal touch here. And highly personal.
And it obviously worked because 2 days later he had an hour and a half
He
meeting.
gets a meeting.
He gets a meeting with him. But the other thing is
with the guy who's going to run Shriver's World, basically.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
And the president's basically just created a mechanism to allow him to do it. So he doesn't need. I mean, Shriver's his brother-in-law. He's got to pay attention here, and he's a formidable guy. But
so
the
he takes
structure.
the meeting.
He takes the meeting. Yeah.
He takes the meeting.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
But the structure is not one that is forcing La Boise.
That's right. And as Bill has said many times, I think you know, Sarge hated bureaucracy. And I think one of the reasons he did is because the patterns of decision-making and cooperation that bureaucracies have kind of prevent thinking sometimes. They prevent the ability to sort of sit down and work it out and be nuanced. And he was definitely trying to.
Well, he felt they were an impediment to progress, and I think that's true. And it was not just bureaucracy in the sense that we think about bureaucracy in governmental terms, though he was a very, very strong, faithful son of the Catholic Church. He hated the prelates. He would spit out the word prelates whenever the Catholic Church did something that was really upsetting to him. He saw the group around the Pope as the enemy of the faith.
It's structures that lead to bad decisions, to bad faith that he didn't like.
I also think that just as we think about creating change in the world, building organizations, getting people aligned to our way of thinking in whatever endeavor, he went for a personal connection. He actually went right into the potential source of conflict, right? Not exclusively, but he could have avoided La Boise. He could have gone around, tried to go around, tried to come up through his brother-in-law, the President of the United States. He could have backdoored it. And there are other avenues we're going to see here that are in place, so I don't want to overstate this point. But among the people he seeks out is somebody who is clearly operating from a different understanding of how this should work. He goes right to it. I think oftentimes we are trying to force change without sitting down and talking with people who may have a different point of view with us. And he also does it in a way that suggests, I totally get that we've got two different points of view on this, but I think there's an opportunity for us to have a thoughtful discussion about where our needs and interests might align, and I'd love for you to hear me out. He didn't write an op-ed in the New York Times. He didn't go out and try and make life hell on Capitol Hill for La Boise in some other way in this early phase of the foreign aid program. And there are other strategies that could be employed.
Right.
So I think as you think about your own life, your work, politically, academically, otherwise, there are a lot of instructive lessons here, and you'll see these patterns repeated here throughout as a way of getting things done or convincing people of your point of view. And a lot of it was through his own sheer force of personality as well, and goodwill and his approach to others and being willing to listen. In our timeline, you'll see barely a week later, Bay of Pigs happens. What does that do to this whole kettle of fish, Bill? And Shriver's overseas now. He's on his tour.
Well, you have to understand that the Bay of Pigs was an extraordinary disaster. This was an operation that had been planned by the Dulles brothers, John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State under Eisenhower, and Allen Dulles, his brother, the head of the CIA, designed to overthrow Castro by landing a battalion of Cuban dissidents who had been trained in Guatemala by the CIA, in the expectation, according to the CIA, that the Cuban people would rise up and support the invasion and overthrow Castro. Well, nothing of the sort happened. The group turned out to be ill-trained, ill-equipped, ill-led. They were crushed by Castro's security forces. There was no uprising, and if anything, Castro emerged from that far stronger than he had been before. And some people even think that a consequence of this was the Castro-Khrushchev decision to put missiles into Cuba, which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which happens not so long afterwards.
4 days later, Shriver's on a plane to Ghana, Nigeria, India, Pakistan to try and convince leaders of those countries to allow Peace Corps volunteers. And Jamie, how does this complicate that effort?
I mean, I think the obvious message is that if this is the way the United States moves in the world clandestinely and to overthrow powers, it's all the more important for Peace Corps to be not painted with that brush, and to be autonomous. And he's now going to the head of he's going to India, he's going to the head of the non-aligned world.
Well, and Nkrumah is equally important in Africa.
Yeah, right.
The head of Ghana.
The head of Ghana. To say, we would like you to accept our people, we want to help, and it doesn't help the credibility of that argument to have Bay of Pigs a week old.
Yeah, so this isn't just a theoretical thing, this is a real practical concern for Shriver. So he's off traveling. Tell me about his request to Moyers to involve the vice president. What in this? How does Lyndon
Are
Baines
we
Johnson
sure
become?
that that's true?
Well, I'm not sure. You can tell me. That's what the timeline says.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm not sure that that's true. We need to back up a little bit, if we can, again.
Sure.
Back to the question that Steve asked, well, what would you do confronted by this ambiguity? What he did was to tell my colleague Roger Kuhn and myself to start drafting the Peace Corps Act. In other words, he made a decision that regardless of what bureaucratic or other policy pitfalls lay ahead in the road, he was going to equip himself to be independent if the decision ultimately was made that the Peace Corps would be independent. He was going to be absolutely on top of that as he was in drafting the executive order. The executive order was ready for the president to sign when the president received the report. The Peace Corps Act would be ready to go to Congress, assuming the Peace Corps would be independent of the foreign aid program.
So even at the moment where it seemed less likely that was going to happen, he was still preparing
He's
for it.
pushing. He's pushing ahead. He's pushing. He's always pushing, and he's pushing me all over the place. Well, you know, I can take it.
So tell me about.
So we get a call.
Yeah.
We get a call from Ralph Dungan's office. Now, Ralph Dungan is another long-time Kennedy aide, another member of the Kennedy Mafia, the Irish Mafia, not as close to the president as O'Donnell and Sorensen, but very close to the president. Ralph actually, in the West Wing of the White House in those days, in the southwest corner of the West Wing was Ted's office. In the northwest corner of the West Wing was McGeorge Bundy's office, the National Security Affairs person, and Ralph was in the middle. We had a call from Ralph that we're going to have a meeting to discuss the Peace Corps, and Sarge at this point is gone. I go to that meeting. LaBouisse is there. David Bell, who is the head of the Budget Bureau, who's, you know, the principal advisor on government organization matters, on questions of budget and finance. A wonderful man, thoughtful man. Dungan, LaBouisse, I can't remember who else. So the arguments are played out in front of Dungan, with me making the argument for independence and LaBouisse not saying very much actually, and Bell making arguments that I would describe as arguments for bureaucratic neatness and consolidation, and not arguments that reflected at all any of the program issues or even any understanding that if the Peace Corps were to be part of foreign aid, that would change the dynamic between Sargent and Nkrumah, change the dynamic between Sarge and Nehru, change the dynamic between Sarge and the head of Burma, General Ne Win at that time, or it might have been actually Suu Kyi's father, Aung San. I don't remember any longer, but I think it was General Ne Win. I think her father had already been assassinated. And, you know, that dynamic would have made it extremely difficult for the Peace Corps to have been accepted as in the way we wished it to be accepted overseas. Anyway, Ralph purported on behalf of the president to settle the issue by saying that the Peace Corps would be part of the foreign aid program. So I left the meeting with my tail between my legs.
And then what happened?
And I came back and reported to Wiggins, and Bill Moyers comes into the picture because he had been the vice president's chief senatorial aide. And he said to the vice president very, very early on, I really want to go and work for the Peace Corps. And the vice president understood that this was important to Moyers. I think it struck the same kind of chords in LBJ that are represented by the speech that was in your materials last week that he gave in Lincoln, Nebraska, totally on his own, long before the Cow Palace speech. And so Moyers was released and became the head of recruitment and legislative affairs. And he and I began working very closely on the Peace Corps Act and on the legislative strategy that would accompany it. And it was Moyers who said, I'm going to get the vice president involved in this. And I don't know that it was Sarge's idea. I just am not clear that that's true. But clearly,
some debate over that point. Yeah.
Yeah, it was clearly Moyers' idea, no question about that, and it proved to be crucial. Bill went to the vice president, and a second meeting was had in Dungan's office. Same cast of characters: me, LaBouisse, Bell, Dungan. and the vice president, waiting this time to see the president himself. This was supposed to be a meeting that all of us would have with JFK. In the course of waiting, Johnson, I like to say, virtually picked LaBouisse up by the ears. You have to understand, Johnson is a 6'4", extremely powerful personality, very dynamic, not used as Senate Majority Leader to taking no for an answer, used to getting his own way. And he berated LaBouisse in front of everybody. You're going to destroy the Peace Corps. You're going to strip it of everything that could make it what it could be by immersing it in this discredited program that you may or may not be able to resurrect. It was extremely powerful and extremely nasty.
What questions do you have about any of this, by the way? All right. Bill Moyers later on recounts a meeting that he had. Yeah.
I'm actually just curious, again, going back to my family theme, if there was any sort of relationship between LBJ and Sarge, because LBJ very famously had a very bad relationship with Robert Kennedy. So I was curious.
Well, remember the story that I told about JFK asking Sarge to go talk to Johnson and sound out whether he would accept the vice presidency. So far as I know, that's the only important meeting that Sarge had ever had with Johnson prior to that time. Remember, Johnson is a competitor for the nomination. So Johnson had reason to want to return the good turn, in addition to the programmatic reasons that are so well set forth in that September 22, 1961 speech. We did not get to meet the president. We broke up, went back to our offices. Johnson met with Kennedy later that evening, and Dungan called me up the next day to say that the president had decided that the Peace Corps would be independent of the foreign aid program. And I said to Ralph, well, I'd like to come over, in effect, and smoke the peace pipe because we're going to be working together and we need to have a working relationship. And he rejected my offer.
Why?
He said, you wanted to be independent, you're on your own. When you get into trouble, don't come running to us for help. You know, it was very much a part, I think, of the inchoate Irish mafia hostility to Sarge and therefore to the Peace Corps, exaggerated or exacerbated by the fact that they had tried to put Shriver in his place, tried to put the Peace Corps in its place, and they had failed. They didn't like to fail. Neither did I.
My understanding, though, is that that ultimately was also the position that the president had as well, that if now as you go to Capitol Hill on behalf of the Peace Corps Act, I'm not going to be putting extra muscle, White House muscle, to help you along.
That's
correct.
Is
that fair to say?
That's correct.
So was there bad blood that had been created there?
I don't know whether there was bad blood or not. I was unaware of the conversation that the president had with Eunice until we began putting this program together. But did I have any relationship with the White House, with Larry O'Donnell, the head of the president's legislative program, on these issues? None whatsoever.
So essentially, if you're Sarge now, you've won this fight. The president has come back around to where you wanted him to be, to where he said he would be initially. now you have folks in the White House whose noses are out of joint over that. You have Labouisse and others in the foreign aid apparatus who I'm sure are not pleased by this decision. You now have to go convince Congress to sign on to the Peace Corps Act that Bill Josephson and Bill Moyers have been working on. And you now know that you're not going to have the White House to help you essentially pass a bit of legislation that is backed by, or was it, what was the outgrowth of the president's own plans. You're on your own. You're on your own. Is that a fair characterization?
That's a fair characterization.
What do you do? Where do you start now? Yeah.
I just have a quick question. So Sarge was off doing his world tour at
Right.
this point. What was his involvement with all of the backroom deals going on and all of the fight for autonomy while he was out of the country? Did he just wholly just give the authority to you and to his other advisors and said, like, I trust what you're doing, or were you like constantly calling with him? Or?
Well, we knew what his position was as a result of the Ritz-Carlton meeting and the Ritz-Carlton memorandum. I actually never saw the letter to Labouisse until we began putting this together. He really handled that as Steve has described, as a very personal approach. Although the document that he attached to it is quite clearly, I think, a crib of the Ritz-Carlton memorandum that was delivered by me to Richard Goodwin, Ted Sorensen's chief assistant. So it wasn't a question of saying, you know, deal with this. He had established his policy. We knew what his policy was. It was very clear. And so in his absence, Warren and Bill and I took it upon ourselves to do what we could to carry out that policy. And of course, as the story unfolded, Bill's decision to join the Peace Corps and his relationship with Johnson, which, as you know, continues after the assassination in an extraordinary way, was crucial, absolutely crucial. Without Johnson's intervention, clearly we would have lost. And one of the consequences of that was that Sarge asked Johnson to chair the Peace Corps National Advisory Council, and Johnson agreed to do that.
We had other hands, yeah.
Well, you know, I feel like even though you don't have JFK's support necessarily in helping you with this, I mean, if you have Johnson's support, he knows everyone in the Senate better than anyone else, and he could be a good asset to have.
And also, his support means you get the support of Sam Rayburn, who was his mentor. And, you know, it's hard to understand, given the history of the recent House speakership, but Mr. Sam, as we used to call him, was an amazing person. You know, he used to hold in the afternoons in the Speaker's chamber what was known as Mr. Sam's schoolhouse. Anybody, any representative who wanted to come in and sit and talk about the legislative agenda, the legislative techniques, what the Speaker thought, what the Speaker's strategy was welcome to come and sit. And there was this wonderful conversation going on every afternoon. So life in those days was completely different from what it appears to be now.
What other questions have not surfaced about this? Jamie, what lessons should we be drawing from this condensed period of time, but pivotal period for the Peace Corps? How do we understand Shriver as a political operator in the context of the larger themes of this case study?
Well, I mean, I think he's a very shrewd and wise political operator. He's really, I think, consistent in his. I mean, I don't think there's any difference between the principles and the approach that he brought to designing the Peace Corps and thinking about how there ought to be peace and collaboration and how systems ought to be run, and the kind of plan that was developed for that program, and the way he administers the Peace Corps and tries to institutionalize it. It's kind of ironic that the one time that he had to engage in, or you guys had to engage in a power play, which was to get Vice President Johnson to go around the decision makers, in effect, or go over their heads to the president, and then the president, made the decision to alienate some of his staff. That had consequences to do it that way. I think it's clear that as a last resort, that's how Sarge viewed that kind of political approach. But he was also, my understanding is, he was also extremely principled about that. When he came back from his trip, I mean, I don't know if he was suspecting, or if Bill, if you suspect, that part of the timing of the decision making was to let Sarge get out of the country so that he wasn't there. Maybe it just happened.
No, I don't think it was that at all. The trip was being very carefully planned, starting in late February.
Right.
And that in turn involved, multiple approaches to the ambassadors in the various countries that we thought we should visit. Some were for it, some were against it. Those who were for it had to lay a basis with the governments to which they were accredited to make sure that Shriver would be welcome, to make sure that the conversations about the Peace Corps would be productive. An enormous amount of groundwork was being laid for that trip, which did not happen, could not happen. These trips never happen overnight. Right. These trips are always, very, very carefully planned. And if the reaction overseas had been negative, that would have been a terrible blow to the Peace Corps. Could have meant the end of the Peace Corps.
Sure. At the end of the day, despite the fact that we've seen evidence of Shriver's skill and his personal relationships and strategic thinking, is this really this 1 month period here, the story of a guy who was successful because he was the brother-in-law of the president?
Well, that certainly is a factor, no question about it. But also, thinking about this, here's the thought that I've never had before, to contrast Sarge and his way of doing business with LBJ and his way of doing business. You're dealing with two men who have very, very powerful intellects. But Sarge, true to the caricature of him as a Boy Scout that Sorensen and O'Donnell continually painted, was always very nice, very decent, very thoughtful, very believed in persuasion, believed in personal relationship. You very, very well analyzed the approach that underlies the La Bouisse letter. It's characteristic Shriver. Johnson was a figure of power. Johnson could be and was often a bully. Johnson often tormented people. He often, in effect, bribed people. You want this, I want that. And Johnson understood a factor that is very important to the presidency, and that is fear. The president has to be feared to be effective. And Johnson ultimately was feared, and that was a big source of his effectiveness as majority leader and as president. Sarge never played the fear factor. He was incapable of being feared. Would you agree with that?
Incapable of being feared? That I would agree. He was certainly, a hard driving man. He, as you say, he pushed you around or drove, or so he had high expectations.
That's a different issue.
It is a different issue. So he didn't motivate by fear. He motivated by the integrity of his positions.
By example.
And by example, and got cooperation not by generating threat, but by triggering. I mean, you put it yourself. You said, I had the sense that my future was dependent upon being with this great man. There was something about being with Sarge that enabled you as you were 25, 26 at this point?
25, 26.
Say.
And so is Moyers, and there's something about Moyers that sensed that to become Bill Moyers, he needed to get out from under Johnson.
So that there's a way that one's valuing, one's aspirations, one's sense of what would be better and how can I most fulfill what's good about my life and where I'm being called to. There's an aura that Sarge had that made people feel that that was really possible no matter how hard you had to work to do it.
Let me give an opportunity for one final round of questions here, or comments, yeah.
I just had a quick question about when you were talking about JFK also said basically that you're on your own in terms of moving forward with the Senate. Do you think that was kind of to mollify the other side of the equation with his other advisors,
Sure.
or do you think it was for some other reason?
No, I think it was to mollify them. That, that was the price we had to pay for winning that fight.
And according to Sarge's biographer, I think that's where I learned this, that when Sarge came back from his trip and learned that, in effect, JFK and his staff had said, you're on your own now, he was a little taken aback. So he asked his wife, the president's sister, to find out if that was really true. He didn't go ask JFK himself. I don't know, maybe he was, I'm not sure why.
He certainly didn't ask me.
And then she reported back, yeah, I talked to my brother, and you are on your own. And
Because he'd spent political capital internally.
Oh, sure.
totally.
JFK, right? Going
Certainly.
against top advisors,
Going
out.
against David Bell,
Yeah. Yeah.
who ultimately heads the foreign aid
Yeah,
program when it
yeah.
turns out that La Boise is a failure.
Yeah.
His principal advisor on public administration.
He couldn't also be seen as constantly kowtowing to the whims of his brother-in-law for some of the concerns you're already talking
Correct.
about. So he gave him this victory, but basically said, that's the last
That's
I can
it.
give. That's it.
And
And it's come at some internal credibility costs for me.
And and Sarge also said, I'll never ask the president for anything else.
He said that, Sergeant Driver. So fascinating internal dynamic. I want to make sure, I want to draw your attention to a letter that we added to the Dropbox folder for your reading on your own. It's Bill Moyers' letter of June 27th, 1978 to Clem Zablocki. And it's obviously a good 16 years after the events of this session, but he recounts a conversation that he had with Sergeant Shriver and LBJ about the very issue of the independence of the Peace Corps. And he's quoting here, I presume it's not from a recorded transcript, but from Bill Moyers' own memory. So, take that for what it is.
I think it's probably from what Johnson told him about the meeting
Yes,
with Kennedy.
yes. But a wonderful, very colorful example, I think, of Johnson's style, manner of speaking, but also the clarity and strategy that he saw in the need to keep this independent from bureaucratic
And
meddling.
it's essentially the hectoring of La Boise that took place in the meeting, almost
It's
word
so
for word.
it's a very short letter. It's 3 pages. It's well worth a read. It'll take you 5 minutes. It's great. So the other thing I want to say is we've spent a lot of time today just on a very concentrated 1-month period of time around this question of autonomy. The idea here was to highlight a few things. One, to bring some of the approaches to conflict resolution that apply to the vision for the Peace Corps overall and actually bring them into a very practical political sphere. To look at ways in which those approaches are successful, ways in which those approaches were used, and ways in which they weren't. To think about the way in which Sergeant Shriver's personal abilities and his relationships, beyond even the familiar ones, were used to bring people around to a way of thinking, the way in which he was unsuccessful in that, the way in which he actually pulled in other relationships and curried favor, and the cost that that actually racked up as well. We'll go into next week. We have a bunch of PSAs, a bunch of advertisements, commercials.
May I just add one more thing?
Please.
The other reason we did it, and maybe Brittany can testify to this, is that the first couple of sessions led up to, this is for to the degree that this case study sets kind of a paradigm for what the fellowship and the workshops in the winter and spring are for the Shriver Fellowship. There is, once you have a method that develops a way of solving a problem, and then you have to institutionalize it. Then you have to fight for it. Then there's one set of skills and one set of problems to say, well, what's our program design? Another one is, can we get it institutionally affected? And so and then once you have it institutionally affected, how do you implement it? And those are all phases and problem sets that you'll be looking at as a Shriver Fellow in winter and spring.
I'm so glad you raised this point, and we'll have, perhaps at our next session, have some Shriver Fellows talk about this, but they designed the Chicago Peace Corps. They know what they're going to do. They've figured out what it should look like. They need to get buy-in from Chicago Public Schools. They need to get buy-in from principals and teachers to allow them to operate.
Police.
Not everybody, and not everybody wants them in the same way. They need to figure out what's their funding source and what's their relationship to the IOP. They've had this through the Shriver program, but what's year 2? Should they be an independent entity? Should they be an RSO on campus? Should they be a student civic engagement project of the IOP? These are all questions that they were
What's their
wrestling with.
relationship to the Sergeant Shriver Peace Institute?
That's right.
All of that.
What's the relationship to the university as a whole?
And Brittany, does this resonate with you? Brittany's a Shriver Fellow. Yeah.
Those were all questions that we talked about a lot during the summer. I think another thing that you brought up during this session is trust, like trusting and communicating with the other parties and how you create those kind of bonds. And I know that some people were talking about, like, how was Shriver able to navigate, like, the bureaucracy while being JFK's brother-in-law, which is, like, a very delicate position for his brother-in-law and also for him. So I think another thing that we had to learn a lot was how to have people trust us, considering that we're just a bunch of undergraduates who now want to go into schools and help children. So.
Undergraduates from the University of Chicago, an elite prestigious institution.
Right, yeah.
Many of you are not from Chicago as a city and grew up here.
Or from this country.
Yes, or from this country. That's absolutely right.
Yeah. And our youth was, something that a lot of people were skeptical about, but also it was an addition. Because what we discovered is that a lot of the restorative justice initiatives in the city tend to be on the older side, but since we're working with children and with teenagers, having a younger face was often seen as a huge plus. So,
yeah. That's fascinating. There are a lot of parallels. And next week, we will go deeply into a couple of areas. We'll have more on the effort to get this passed through Congress, where we'll continue some of these themes.
There's a lot of materials in your syllabus for this session which we didn't get to cover, which we need to cover next time.
The other thing, though, is how you build support for the program internationally with the host nations. So we'll talk a little bit more about those trips. But as I mentioned, these advertisements, these commercials, we'll play a bunch of them. This is an effort to inspire volunteers and also to address some of the critics that we saw referenced in a few of those letters to the editors and editorial pages. So this will be about how do you make it live in the world and attract people to this. So that'll be next week's session. So thank you, Bill. Thank you, Jamie. Appreciate it. Thank you all very much for being here and for the conversation. All right, we'll see you next week.
I have a set of